Welcome to Weekend Office Hours with Professor Paul Denari. My name is Sirish Pulusani. Welcome back, Paul. We're going to continue talking about the war in Ukraine, about the latest events. And just to start off and just to give a little timestamp, it's officially December 2022 right now. Winter has started. The war is going to slow down. And the latest news from this war, the British Ministry of Defense says it's obtained official confidential survey that shows only 25% of Russians want the war to go on. So what does this mean as winter is going to really have a major impact on both sides? But also Ukraine is making some significant gains. I mean, there was just reports that Ukrainian special forces were seen across the east bank of the Dnipro River, chasing down Russians. So, you know, poor morale in Russia, Ukraine making some gains, winter is coming. What's happening?
Yeah, well, you've provided a very good summary. So let me try to take those things one at a time. Russian public opinion. We always wonder about the quality of Russian public opinion polls, but it is the case that the Russian government, Putin's people, pay a lot of attention to public opinion, and they have their own polling operation. So from what we can tell, right, British spies have maybe gotten their hands on some of this internal polling that the Kremlin's people do themselves. And so I think the question is, to the extent that these data are accurate and valid, what's the likelihood it's going to shape Kremlin policy, Putin's policy? And I'll count myself as a skeptic. I think from the Kremlin's perspective, the sort of mass of mostly inert citizens are not what they're worried about right now. If people actually start protesting and other things start happening, that may change. But right now, it seems they're much, much more worried about the idea of what will happen to their rule if Russia loses this war. That's the sense we get. And so I think it's incredibly interesting to have that data and to have another, data point. And of course, all this public opinion polling has to be taken with a grain of salt. But that there's serious war fatigue in Russia, because in many respects, a war like this, and most wars, right, are contests of which country's citizens will put up with it the longest.
Yeah, that completely makes sense. And I just want to put this in a broader perspective. We've seen protests raging across many other authoritarian regimes, from China to Iran. Is there anything happening in Russia? I mean, you would think if there's any country where the citizens are going to, stand up for wrongdoings, potentially. I mean, the country is getting conscripted. This war is dragged on. You would think there would be some major uprisings in Russia. Is anything happening?
No, and it's because of the effectiveness of sort of preemptive Russian repression. The Russian people have voted with their feet, which is to say they've left the country, either if they're opposed to the war or if they simply want to evade the draft. They've left the country, and or they're voting with their feet within the country in terms of going somewhere where the people who are in charge of the draft can't find them. From what we can tell, a lot of people sort of hiding, changing their residence, moving somewhere else so that they can't be drafted. So there's this sort of passive opposition. I just want to say it's passive opposition.
So there is passive opposition, but what measures does Russia have in place? Like, for instance, China. We see large-scale protests in China. You think the military-industrial surveillance complex of China would be much more significant than in Russia, for instance, like that. What are the Russian citizens more afraid of?
I think they're afraid of being grabbed up and thrown in a Russian prison for 10 years. And that's a real likelihood. The situation in China is a little bit different, in part because the numbers of protesters are so big and there's a certain spontaneity to it that at least initially it was very hard to just go arrest them all and throw them all in jail. But they took a whole bunch of measures to make it harder and harder and harder for people to gather in large numbers. And they're very good at this. They closed some universities to prevent the students from getting together. They're loosening up on the things that people were complaining about. And however, right, I think you can bet over the next several months, using cell phone data and everything else, they're going to be visiting a lot of those people who are out protesting and having serious conversations with them about their futures.
Yeah, I can only imagine. But you also
it's a different. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No. Sorry, I was just going to say that you also alluded to the fact that 10 years in a Russian prison. I mean, historically, they've sent people to the Gulag, Siberia. I mean, these crazy work camps. I mean, just talk a little bit about like what they've done with people who protest in Russia.
Yeah, I mean, the best example that we know of right now is this guy Alexei Navalny, who's been arrested on trumped-up charges and is serving, I think now it's like a 10 or a 15-year sentence in one of these Russian labor camps where the conditions are absolutely terrible. A lot of us have been following the case of Brittany Griner, an American basketball player who may have actually been guilty of something, but basically it's a political prosecution. Historically, of course, it was much, 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 much worse. Right. In the Soviet era, they sent millions of people to the so-called Gulag, this state prison camp system. And many, many of them never came back because they worked them to death, froze them to death. People know this.
Yeah, I can only imagine. So now, support is falling in Russia. Winter is here. And Ukraine is gaining some ground, it seems like, as well. So what does that mean for Ukraine? I mean, I think Russia has really increased shelling of cities. Civilian destruction has increased. So what does this all mean?
Yeah, I've talked to a lot of my friends and colleagues in Ukraine over the last week, and it's tough sledding to be, that's probably not the right expression to use. It's tough right now. The economy is really struggling because any of the economy that depends on having regular power, all that incredible Ukrainian IT industry, it's very hard to do that work if you don't have electricity. People are increasingly cold. Every time you're on a video with somebody in Kiev, they're bundled up in sweaters because there's just no heat. The question from a military perspective is, how do you convert making the average Ukrainian cold and sitting in the dark? How do you convert that into military victory on the battlefield? And I don't really see a strategy to doing that. So far, there's no sign that it has shaken Ukrainians' their will to resist one bit. On the contrary, the reaction from the Ukrainians is this is just more evidence of what will happen to Ukrainians who end up under Russian rule. They will kill us. And so sooner or later, it seems to me, the Russians, if they really want to take over Ukraine, and they keep on saying they do, they're going to actually have to win on the battlefield. And it's not clear they've got a plan that will help them do that yet.
So you're saying it's increasing the will of the Ukrainians to keep on fighting.
Absolutely.
And we don't see any major significant victories from Russia on the actual battlefield.
That's correct.
Yeah. And just so historically speaking, I mean, this has been a feature of war for so long where leaders have sought to impose their will through civilian destruction. Has it ever worked in the past?
Only at the very far margins, which is, so one example is the strategic bombing campaign that the United States did against Germany, England, the Allies against Germany in World War II. And we blew up a lot of stuff. But both in terms of the will to fight and the industrial production, it really had no impact, right? What it took was the German, the American and the Soviet armies meeting in the middle of Germany and basically saying, okay, now you're finished. I always think about the U.S. Civil War and, Sherman's famous march through Georgia. That was a strategy that was really aimed at making the Southerners miserable. And it did. And I think it certainly reduced the will to fight. But again, until they cornered Robert E. Lee's army in Virginia, and it was basically put it in a position where it was going to fight a battle that Lee knew they could not win, that the South surrendered. So it's sooner or later, you almost always have to win on the battlefield.
Yeah, that makes sense that you have to win on the battlefield, but doesn't the destruction, I mean, maybe it's certain industries, maybe it's killing civilians that can't then join to fight. Doesn't it affect the battlefield itself, though?
Absolutely. Absolutely. The problem for Russia in this war is that Ukraine is being supplied by the West. If this were just Russia against Ukraine, already Ukraine would have run out of all kinds of crucial war materials, right? And that potentially would have tipped the military balance in Russia's favor. The problem is the places that the arms for Ukraine are coming from are places that Russia, either can't or won't bomb, namely, Ohio, and places like that. And this is one of the things that I see now happening, and we're just in the early stages, but you see the United States Defense Department is starting to actually let contracts to hire, to get companies to build more of these weapons for this, both for the war itself, but also to replenish stocks. And, if you imagine, let's say this war goes on into 2024 and you get the American defense manufacturing economy revved up like you did in World War II, there's no way Russia can match that. And even if they're buying stuff from Iran and Korea, North Korea, once the American and the Western economies, but especially the American economy, once it gets geared up to produce weapons, the Russians are going to be toast. And so it's a question of trying to create a lack of will to do so.
Mm-hmm,
right?
mm-hmm.
This war now is all about morale and will, because the Russians don't have the ability to win without a collapse of Western will.
Mm-hmm. So you talk about morale, will, weapon supply. That all seems to be on the Ukrainian side. What about actual fighters, though? I mean, we saw Russia drew up an enormous amount of people, conscripted people. Does Ukraine? I mean, how big is Ukraine? 21 million or something?
No, Ukraine's pre-war population was about 45 million.
Okay,
so it's not a small country.
Okay, so do they have an issue with sufficient fighters?
Not yet. It's a country of 45 million people. They've prevented men of military age from leaving the country, except with a few exceptions. And so let me put it this way, try to simplify. Russia has 3 times the population of Ukraine. So other things being equal, you think there's 3 times as many people they can put into the army. But I think the Ukrainians' willingness to fight probably offsets that.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Which is, there's a lot of Russians that are basically going to get nowhere near this war.
Mm-hmm.
And in Ukraine, basically not everybody wants to fight, but there's a huge willingness to fight. I was talking to somebody the other day who was saying, one of the problems they had to solve in Ukraine was supplying military uniforms for women who are 6 months pregnant.
Wow.
Right.
Wow.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And it's not like every 6-month pregnant woman in Ukraine is itching to go off to war, but the level of commitment to this war on the Ukrainians, I think, offsets the sort of population advantages that the Russians have.
Okay.
We'll see. We will see.
No, that makes sense. But you spoke to something here, because the reason Ukraine is able to do this is because the threat to them is existential. And we've talked about this before. Whereas to the average Russian, the threat is not necessarily existential. So Ukraine is going to do everything that they need to do to survive. On the other hand, the threat to Putin's government, if this war is lost, is existential, which then brings us back to the question, what is he going to do when the war is done? And we've discussed this, dissected this multiple times, but anything else to add to this topic?
No, actually, there's one thing to add, which is there was a lot of talk this week, including some meetings at the United Nations and an endorsement by somebody who was at one of the European leaders of a war crimes trial to hold Russian leaders to account for this.
Mm-hmm.
And from a justice perspective, absolutely, these are war crimes. The invasion from the beginning was a war crime, but there's also all kinds of war crimes been committed, crimes against humanity, and arguably, and I'm right, genocide. However, to the extent that you say part of ending the war is Putin gets put in the dock in The Hague, that actually makes it harder to end the war.
Exactly.
And so all these things, right, there's going to be a lot of stuff on the table somewhere down the road about what are the conditions in which the war ends. And I think the fundamental underlying problem for the West is still this idea that we want Ukraine to win, but we don't want them to win so much that Russia uses a nuclear weapon. And so the genius, I won't quite call it genius, but the real leverage of Putin's strategy at this point, right, is the threat of nuclear weapons, deterring Western involvement, and creating this wedge between Ukraine and its Western supporters.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And the further the lines move to the east, right, and maybe towards the Ukrainians starting to think they're going to take back Crimea, right, the more that wedge gets driven.
Mm-hmm. What do you think would be a major first sign that Putin is willing to risk it all?
Oh, to risk it all? I think I will say that I thought the first sign was Kherson. I thought an obvious place, if Russia's going to use nuclear weapons, where they might use nuclear weapons, would be to hang on to Kherson, and they didn't do it. There will be some technical signs that intelligence agencies can pick up about certain kinds of weapons being moved and fueled, and warheads being taken out of storage bunkers and put on weapons and stuff like that. I think part of the problem is it's very hard to signal credibly in a situation like this, right? Putin said months ago, he said, I mean it, right? But he's never actually painted any particular red lines. He's never said, Kherson you can have, but if you go to Crimea, I'm going to nuke you, right? And in a way, it would be helpful if he did. But the problem is wherever he draws that red line, then he can bet that the West is going to help the Ukrainians go right up to it. Mm-hmm. So there's always this game of strategic ambiguity, but that leaves room for misunderstanding and miscommunication, and we end up crossing some red line that we didn't realize was a red line. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I'm less worried about nuclear weapons now than I was 6 weeks ago.
Well, that's a good sign, because that was the major, part of the conversation over the past few months, is that with Ukraine continuing to take ground with no sign of negotiation on the table, what is Russia capable of? So if you feel like it's going in the opposite direction, that certainly means something. Yeah. So paint us a picture then. What is like historically December in this region, in Ukraine and Russia right now? These are the sites of some of the bloodiest conflicts in history. Obviously, the Eastern Front is known for not being a very harsh mistress to multiple great generals throughout history. So, speak to a little bit about what winter means for this region.
Winter means cold weather, and by cold weather, I mean the kind of weather you would normally get in Michigan this time of year. Cold weather. It means from now up in probably until December, and then the weather, of course, is different every year, but you're talking about rain, snow, and it snowed in Kiev, I think last week or the week before, some beautiful pictures of snow-covered Kiev, stuff that in a normal circumstance, right, is fine. But if you're a soldier out in a trench somewhere, you've seen these pictures of these Ukrainian soldiers in trenches, in their ankle deep in water from rains. So mud and cold, and eventually, right, the ground will freeze, and that actually makes it more easy to be mobile again. But from now until when the ground freezes, the standard argument is, makes it much harder to move trucks around, especially tanks, which tend to sink in mud. So that's the situation. The big question is, I think most people expect because of this, the war to sort of calm down until sometime in, late February, which is when Russia attacked this past year. I think there's a minority view that feels like the Ukrainians may try to press their advantage. Mm-hmm. We've been very bad so far at predicting what the Ukrainians were going to do, and actually that's a compliment to the Ukrainians. Mm-hmm. They have done an incredible job of maintaining sort of operational secrecy. Mm-hmm.
When you say press their advantage, what specifically do you think Zelensky's goal is over the next month?
Yeah, this is a good question, and I do not know. I can give you a couple of possible scenarios. So you mentioned earlier that that some forces had crossed the Dnipro River down around Kherson. So there could be an idea of we're going to cross at Kherson and try to tackle that big group of Russian forces there that's still shelling Kherson. My best guess is that crossing is more of a more meant to just make a symbolic victory and say to the Russians, see, we can cross the river and come after you. There's an idea if you go further. So the Russian forces are now kind of stretched out along the northern coast of the Black Sea from just east of Kherson, all the way back to Russia. And there's an idea that you might come down from the north mm-hmm. and basically cut them off. Mm-hmm. And so that's one thing that people talk about. And then there's this war that's still going on around Bakhmut in Donetsk Oblast, mm-hmm. where for whatever reasons, the Russians seem to be absolutely determined to capture this town Bakhmut, which is not an unimportant town, but doesn't seem to be as important as the number of casualties they're taking trying to capture it. Mm-hmm. So this is the whole point of Ukrainian strategy, is leave the Russians guessing as to where you're going to go next. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So do you feel then that this season actually favors Ukrainians, the Ukrainian side over the Russian side?
Here's where I think it favors the Russian side, which is the Russians have gotten their nose bloodied. Their nose is bloodied. I don't think they're in much of a shape to do anything right now. So some weather that makes it hard for anybody to do anything probably suits them just fine right now. Yeah. I think the Russian strategy at this point is, they've brought several 100,000 men into the army. We don't exactly know the numbers because they lied about them. But it's lots and lots and lots. I think the idea is let's take the winter to get these guys trained up, get them equipped, and come up with a plan to actually use them come springtime. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of speculation again about where the Russians might attack come February, March of next year. Mm-hmm. There's also people who say that the goal, in fact, is not for the Russians to attack, but simply to use these forces to bolster the territory that they've taken, dig in trenches, and basically the Russian strategy now is simply to hold what they've taken, what they've got so far. Mm-hmm.
So I mean, we'll see. So it sounds like while the war it might not have as much traction as it has had in the past in the media or anything like that, it's still going to be a brutal winter for both sides, unfortunately. Yep. As we celebrate the holidays over here in the U.S., we have a lot to be thankful for. A real bloody war going on, and it just remains to be seen. And we'll continue discussing this and see how events play out. Thanks as always, Paul, for your great analysis.
Thank you.
All right, take care.
Bye.
Bye.
See ya.